All right, so today's video is actually a viewer recommended video. So, right, there's different types of hose, braids, lines, fittings, yada, yada, yada. So, he actually requested a video going over the common types. So, here we are. Going to go over that today. So, specifically, AN or JIC. Technically, that's JIC, but everyone ended up calling this style hose AN for its mil-spec Army-Navy designator. But technically, the SAE term is JIC. Not that that matters. Almost everyone, we call them 8AN lines. Okay, so before I get into the AN stuff, I have some NPT stuff here that I want to get out of the way so there's no confusion. So this end is an NPT threading. NPT fids, threads seal in the thread, so they require thread sealant. Okay, so it's a tapered thread. So if I were to measure the thread diameter down at the base, right, I'm around 0.9, and then as I scroll down, it's getting thinner, 0.8, 0.1, 0.79. It gets thinner and thinner. So an NPT, the way an NPT fitting works is it's a tapered thread, so it's narrower and wider narrow at the base, wider at the top, and then it requires some kind of thread sealant. And as you seal it, it gets tighter because the tapered threads are getting wider, and then it locks in the threads, and then you just want some kind of thread sealant to prevent leaking from happening, right? So an AN or JIC fitting is a straight cut thread, right? So in this case, I have an 8AN male fitting, and zero this. It is the same diameter, right? It's a straight cut. It's the same diameter, which should be around 0.75 for 8AN, yep. Right? So that's the term we commonly use called a straight cut thread. And there's two types. There's AN flare, that's a flare, and there's AN orb, or O-ring boss, that is straight cut thread, uses an O-ring to seal. Straight cut 8AN with a flare seal. And I'll get into all that in a minute. But just to get that out of the way. So AN or JIC lines, you never use thread sealant. Not required. Does not do anything. I could put 10 feet of thread tape in the straight threads and it will not seal. The system seals in the thread. Or sorry, not in the thread, in the flare seat. So I've actually cut the end of a hose end off here just to show you. Right, so here's an 8AN hose end. I cut this off. So inside the female, there's a female flare seat and a male, and they seal via that flare seat just like that. So that's how these fittings seal when assembled. When you assemble a hose end to a fitting, it's the 37-degree flare seat in there that seals, not the threads. All right, I think I brought that home. That's usually the first thing guys are confused about if they've never used JIC or AN lines before. So, NPT, thread sealant. AN or JIC, no thread sealant. Moving on. All right. I'll get more into depth into how it seals and all that in a little bit. I think the next thing I'll talk about is types of hose. So, there's two common in-tank hoses. The most common one you've seen is this. It is a PTFE, or it's Teflon. So the word Teflon is copyrighted by the company that invented it. The chemical composition is polytetrafluoroethylene. So the reason you see PTFE lines everywhere, which is PTFE, polytetrafluoroethylene, is because they can't use the word Teflon because it's copyrighted. So Teflon is actually a name brand for PTFE, or polytetrafluoroethylene. Blah, 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 blah. All right. So this is a corrugated, and the reason it's corrugated, it has good flexibility. So corrugated PTFE line, and PTFE can come in different colors. This one happens to be black. A lot of times it's an off-white or clear color. It's more flexible, that's why it's corrugated. It's for attaching like fuel pump outlets inside fuel hats and stuff. So these These kind of lines in your tank should only use 2 types of clamps. First preferred is called a locking or a crush clamp. It's a one-time use band style clamp. So essentially it's kind of like a zip tie. So the way it works is when you crush the end here and squeeze it, when I squeeze this end, the whole clamp 360 degrees gets smaller. And then it's got little notches and locks in it, kind of like a zip tie, right? In a zip tie, it's got all those little notches, right? Then when I put through the end and every time I pull it tighter, it clicks and locks tighter and tighter. So these are locking clamps, or commonly referred to as crush or band clamps. So these are the kind of clamps you want to use on smooth PTFE because there's no braiding, there's no reinforcement. You don't want to use a worm gear clamp with serrated fins. It'll tear this kind of hose up. The other kind of clamp commonly used, which is more forgiving, right? So the crush clamp, single time use, once it's on, it's done. OEMs prefer this. When I build hats, if it's a permanent type hose, I use these. If it's a user installed or something that needs to be serviced later, you can use what's called a fuel injection hose clamp, which is this. So it is a band clamp, but uses a bolt and locking threaded tab on the other side to pull the clamp tight in a similar fashion, but it's reusable, right? So 3 types of clamps that I went over: crush clamp or locking clamp, one-time use; fuel injection band clamp, more forgiving; and then your standard worm gear clamp. The only real clamp you should be using a worm gear with for fuel is either Pushlock or rubber outer braided hose, because it is thick enough and durable enough to use this kind of clamp. I'll get more into that in a minute. So that's pretty much it for corrugated in fuel tank PTFE line. I'm gonna get this out of the way. The next common one we see in and outside the tank is submersible fuel line. There's non-submersible and submersible. This happens to be the submersible version of fuel line. It's an SAE 30R10. So what it is it's a nitrile rubber-based hose. Let me see if I can get that to focus. And it has a polyester braid reinforcement to give it strength. And then what makes this version 30R10 SAE submersible, right? You'll even see this one happens to say submersible on it, is it has a FKM coating on the inside and outside. So FKM is like a fluoroelastomer polymer. So it's a very heat and chemical resistance coating. So it has that FKM polymer on the outside and has a liner on the inside, which makes it submersible safe and makes it highly resistant to like ethanol, chemicals, alcohol, wide variety of uses. Similar style hose, but it just won't have the outside coating, is what we call socketless hose or pushlock hose. Guys, you should never be using pushlock on EFI for fuel. There are so many better options, and the price difference isn't that much. Yes, socketless hose ends. I actually don't have any here because I have no reason to use them. They're not adequate. A lot of companies sell them. Most common are like Fragola, or there's a couple brands that make them. But right on a pushlock hose, what it's relying on is no clamp or socketless. What happens is you force the hose on, and then it relies on the kind of reminds me of like an arrowhead or a hook. It has these reverse little notches on the barb to help hold the hose on to prevent it from blowing off under pressure. Couple problems with that, right? So I have the hose, it's a certain diameter, and then I have the barb, which matches that inside diameter, right? But then it has these little notches coming out, right? The little barbs. So what happens is it actually stretches the hose into the point of failure, right? So you look at Pushlock hose like, oh, it's rated to 200 PSI. That's great. I only operate from 40 to 80 PSI in my fuel system. That's what the hose is rated to. You're not going to find a rating for the end, right? So a lot of times the guys are like, "Oh, I'll put a clamp on it." Yes, that's safe. First of all, I would never run push lock on fuel system. If I was, I would absolutely put a clamp on it, right? But if you just look at this, you'll even see it. If I was to force this hose onto the barb, you would see the hose stretched out, right? It's going to tear up the liner, and it's gonna stretch the hose thin where the barbs are to the point of failure. So after heat and pressure cycles, my hose isn't going to fail. My hose end barb connection in the end is what's going to fail. Does that make sense? So don't do it. Use it for air, use it for coolant, low pressure kind of dealies. I would never use it for fuel or hydraulic fluid. So, push lock or socketless hose doesn't belong in a fuel system. Moving on. That brings me to AN or JIC style hose. So I have here some of the most common types. I guess I'll start with the cheapest, which would be this. This is actually it's called AeroQuip Startlight. So AeroQuip Startlight has a nitrile-based rubber hose and an Aramid Kevlar Nomex braiding, right? No steel reinforcement, right? Where if you look in this CPE hose, which I'll talk about in a minute, it has steel line impregnated in the hose to reinforce it to make it stronger. Improves pressure rating, pressure cycles, burst strength. So, pros about this hose. It's cheap. It's one of the cheapest braided lines you're going to find. AeroQuip Startlight. Just don't. I would advise at least at a minimum CPE. I don't use Startlight in any of my kits. I use CPE, and I'll talk about why in a minute. So I use CPE, and then two of my higher end hoses that I like to use are Flex LP and stainless steel PTFE. No stainless braid, and this will have the shortest service life. So this one's kind of old. It's really hard. I can actually hear it crack if I bend it too much. It's just been laying around my garage forever. So this is AeroQuip Startlight. It does use a compression, right? So push lock is push or socketless. All normal AN uses a compression socket. So I'll take one of these apart real quick. So this Startlight, this Flex LP line here, and the CP line will all use a standard. I have a fitting. Compression socket, right? And I'm not going to go into detail how to install these. I have another video where I tell you how to cut and install hose ends on AN hose. Actually, I'll link that in the description if you want to check it out. But this will just to show you. So essentially how it works is either of these lines, the collar gets pushed in. There's a seat inside. And then when you tighten in the actual hose end, it expands inside just in the tip slightly and uses compression on a seat in here to lock the hose in so it won't come out. All right, so that's the basis of the hose end. All right, so I talked about Startlight. It's cheap. Don't use it. There are better options. The main reason, other than service life and construction's not as robust, is it's the most susceptible to weeping fuel smell. So that's kind of a phenomenon with some types of hose, actually most types. The only one that 100% eliminates it is this, which I'll get into in a little bit. But what does it mean? So when it weeps, it's not actually leaking any fuel or vapor. So what's happening is the rubber inside, whether it's synthetic rubber or nitrile rubber or whatever, the fuel molecules are a certain size. Well, the odor molecule, right? So the vapor and liquid fuel molecules are, a certain size. All right, this will probably help me draw it. I got some little like carbon, hydrogen fuel molecules, whatever. They're a certain size. The the smell of gasoline, the molecules that actually carry the odor, are much smaller molecules, right? So, as you know, rubber is porous to some degree. What can happen is if you let the car sit, especially outdoors, no problem. You'll probably never even notice. If you regularly store your car indoors in an enclosed area with no ventilation, fuel smell is going to weep out into your garage. And you're going to be like, what's going on? This is crazy. Smells like gas in my garage. My fuel lines are leaking. You're going to look and you're going to actually see there's actually no leak. You had odor smell come through. All right, does that make sense? So that's pretty much it on that. So start light has the most weeping, just because of the nitrile type rubber or whatever, and the braid. It'll actually weep through and then like hold into this braiding. So like even this old hose, I can still smell faint gas on it because it weeped when it was used a long time ago. Weeped smell. All right, the next one is CPE. This one is the go-to. All right. It uses chlorinated polyethylene. So Teflon is, or PTFE is polytetrafluoroethylene. CPE is chlorinated polyethylene. It is also a synthetic rubber. It has the impregnated stainless steel braid and then a nylon outer braid. Okay. And uses the same compression hose end as the start light. It can weep some fuel smell. So it's better. It's not as good. So the only one that won't leak smell fully is either something that is FKM lined or PTFE lined. This actually all PTFE inner line here. So start light leaks can weep odor a lot. CPE a little bit. Okay. So it's a trade-off. Like I said, 99% of the guys this is what we use. I use it. I use this as my standard go-to line in a lot of kits. CPE braided line has a stainless braid and a nylon outer braid. It's a more budget-oriented. It's affordable and it works really great. It'll have a good service life. The occasional guy might find the odor a problem, like I said, if the car is kept a lot indoors. It won't be as bad as Starlight, but this can, over time, weep some odor as well. Okay, and then the last braided type line of this style is the Flex LP. So Flex LP is very similar. Let's see if I can get that to focus. I think the main thing you'll notice is whereas CPE, the stainless is actually kind of impregnated into the outside of the rubber. The stainless braid on Flex LP is completely on the outside of the rubber. And for that reason, it actually flexes better. Like this one's getting a little hard. The CPE will get harder to bend before the Flex LP. So Flex LP, fast to assemble, easy to route, good flexibility. It blocks almost all fuel smell because it does have a liner like that FKM type liner. So this is like 99% no fuel smell. This is a go-to upgrade over CPE if someone has a problem with it. It is more expensive. It's like 30% more. So it does cost you more money. The ends install the same way. Okay. And then the last one, which this line, so stainless PTFE line is actually not much more expensive. Where the expense comes in is in the hose end. So these ends, PTFE line requires a different hose end with an olive or a ferrule. The hose ends are often twice the cost of a standard AN compression hose end. So what does that mean? Like if I'm using 10 to 12 hose ends on my fuel plumbing, it could be $100 plus in hose ends, money you're spending, right? So that's really the biggest con for this. It's also not as bendable, has the least amount of bendability because it is a fully stainless steel outer braid. And then it has 100% PTFE Teflon inner braid, right? I hate these lines. It's a love-hate relationship. They're really good. They're going to have they're not going to wear over time from chemical and heat cycles. It's a very good service line. I hate assembling them. So the biggest difference is on a standard AN line, like I showed you earlier, the collar just slides over, and then I tighten the end into the collar. Well, on PTFE stainless line, I have to get the collar on the line first. And if you notice on this one, because I didn't have the end taped when I cut it, it's going to be almost impossible to try to slide this line on. Right? And even when you do tape it, the end tends to fray, and it's still a big pain in the butt to get these on, because you have to slide this on over first, right? So again, I'm not going to go into detail of how to install it, but you have to slide this on over first, and then your little ferrule, it's either aluminum or brass, it goes, slides over the tip of the PTFE line, so that when you put the hose end on into the PTFE like that, and then lock this collar onto the threads, and it compresses the stainless braid, it doesn't push the braid into the PTFE and cause it to cut, tear, or leak. So this little ferrule has to be installed on the end. And even getting this inside to the ferrule is kind of a pain in the butt. I'm not even going to try to do it right now. So stainless PTFE, longer build times, not as flexible. The hose ends are much more expensive, which can be disheartening. All right, so back to AN or JIC threads. I touched on it earlier, but I'll finish what I want to talk about. So again, it either has a flare or an O-ring boss. So the way a straight cut O-ring boss AN JIC end works is straight cut threads, no sealant, remember? And then it's the wrong size for this. Obviously, that's not going to work. I had one here. So this is a 10 AN orb. This is an 8 AN. Let me grab a 10 AN fitting over here. All right, here's a 10 AN orb to 10 AN male, but just use the filter here. So straight cut threads, installs super easy, right? On an MPT, you're going to turn it like 2 times and it's going to get hard to turn. You're going to need a tool. Because these are straight cut and there's no compression in the threads, I can spin this all the way on by hand. And by hand, that's not going to leak because it uses the O-ring in the top to seal. And then typically the way you want to seal these is get your wrench on there and just a little eek, that little turn. That's all I need, right? So enough so I can't take it off by hand. So a little turn to unloosen it. And that's the appeal. Fast to assemble, and when assembled, less chance of leaking as an NPT thread that needs thread sealant. All right. And then, like that thread fitting I cut away. So the misconception is, when NPT, I need my threaded portion to rotate as it's tapered to seal. If you notice, I'm going to hold the base collar, right? So this collar, so I have one that's not cut and one that is. So it seals, boop, male to female. That's the seal. All the hose end collar is holding the flare seat together, right? So if this would still be here, and I were to turn this in, it would just tighten enough so that the flare seat is held, okay? So like I was talking about, I'm going to hold this still, and I'm going to hold the hose end still. The only thing that's turning is this swiveling collar to draw the male and female flare seat together, right? And that's another appeal, because when I install a hose end on my line, if this was MPT, and my whole line would be twisting and bunching up as I was trying to get it on. Because AN JIC fittings don't seal that way, that's a problem that you don't have to worry about. That's a big pro. Okay, I think I pretty much talked about the hose types, the ends, the threads, some pros and cons. We talked about different style clamps. We talked about not using Pushlock for fuel because that's just stupid. And then I'll go over a couple of things. So JIC AN size is a factor of 16 for the hose size. So an 8 AN hose, if I divide 8 by 16, that reduces to 1/2. So the inside diameter of an 8 AN hose is a 1/2 inch, nominally a 1/2 inch. If I were to say 6 AN divided by 16, that reduces to 3/8. So the inside diameter of a 6 AN hose is 3/8, and so on, right? So if you had a -16 or 16 AN line, like for coolant, that's a 1 inch inner diameter line. 16 over 16 is 1, right? So that's all off hose sizes. So that's how you can quickly find out like what size I should run. I'm doing an oil filter relocation. The stock lines are like 0.42. What size AN do I need? Well, 8 AN I know has a 1/2 inch inner diameter. That'd be a good fit or a slight upgrade. That's pretty much it. So if you have any questions or comments, leave them down there. It was cool to actually do a video that was recommended to me. So yeah, I think that's really all I need to talk about. If I missed something, or if you still had a question about different types of AN lines and fittings, like I said, just leave them down below. Thanks.